The rug came out of the cedar chest, the way old secrets do, slow and a little reluctant, as though it had been waiting for the right hands to ask for it. She spread it across her knees, and the girl beside the hearth leaned forward, chin propped on her fists, watching the firelight catch the strange colors woven through the wool. "Grandmother, what is that pattern? I've never seen anything like it." The old woman's fingers moved over the fibers the way another woman might touch a photograph. The rug was thick and heavy, its colors swirled together in a way no dye pot could ever plan. Rust bleeding into indigo, indigo softening into a bruised violet, violet giving way to a gold that seemed to shift depending on how the firelight fell across it. "No," she said, "you won't have seen its like. Nobody has." That's rather the point of it. The wind pushed against the window glass, and somewhere out past the yard, a dog barked once at nothing. The girl was 16 that winter, old enough to sit up late, young enough still to believe her grandmother had always been exactly as she was now, steady-handed, silver-haired, unhurried. She did not yet know how much had been paid for that stillness. "It looks almost like it was ruined," the girl said, tracing a finger along a seam where the color changed without warning, and then someone tried to fix it. The old woman's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "That is closer to the truth than you know." She folded her hands atop the wool and looked past the girl, past the fire, past the walls of the house that had stood on that same muddy patch of ground for near on 60 years now. When she spoke again, her voice had gone soft and far away, the way it did when she was no longer entirely in the room. "This was the first one I ever made. 1884 it was, out in Oregon Territory, the year I buried your great-grandfather and the year I very nearly lost everything else besides." The girl went still. She had heard pieces before, a widow, a hard winter, land bought cheap, but never the whole of it, never told slow and deliberate like this, with the rug itself laid out as proof. "They said I'd been cheated," the old woman went on. "The whole of Millrace Hollow said it, practically to my face. Called it trash, called it foolishness, and for a good long while, child, I believed they might be right." She smoothed the wool once more, as if greeting an old friend. "But trash has a way of surprising you if you're patient enough to sit with it. Pour yourself something warm and bank that fire a little higher. This is not a short story, and I mean to tell it properly. From the very beginning, when I had nothing to my name but a dead husband's debts and a scrap of ground nobody else wanted. I was 29 years old, and I came into Millrace Hollow with a wagon that wasn't mine to keep much longer, a trunk of linens, and $11 sewn into the hem of my traveling skirt. That was the whole of my fortune. My husband had been gone 4 months by then. A fever took him quicker than I could rightly grieve, and what he'd left behind wasn't land or savings but paper, debts owed to men I'd never met, for tools and seed he'd bought on promise the autumn before he died. I sold what I could. I kept what I needed, and I went looking for ground of my own, because a widow without land in that country was a widow at the mercy of whoever chose to be kind that week, and kindness, child, is a thin blanket in a hard winter. The land office man was patient enough with me. He laid out what claims remained near the settlement, and there weren't many, and none of them good. Most of the decent ground had been taken years before by families with sons enough to work it. What was left was rocky, or too far from water, or already spoken for in ways that hadn't yet been recorded proper. Then there was the scrap beside the dye works. Low ground, he told me plain, and he wasn't wrong. It sat along a bend where the creek liked to spread itself thin over the flats come spring, turning half the plot to standing mud. Nobody wanted it. It smelled faintly of the dye works next door, even from the road, that sharp chemical tang of madder and indigo and whatever else Elias Corbin was boiling in his vats that season. But it was cheap, cheaper than anything else within 20 miles that a woman alone might hope to hold. I walked it myself before I signed a single paper, stood ankle-deep in mud with my hem soaked through, looking at a leaning fence line and a half-collapsed shed that might once have been meant for hogs, and I thought a good many things, most of them not fit to repeat to a girl your age. But I thought, too, it's mine. It would be mine outright, if I could hold it long enough to prove up the claim. Nobody could take it from me the way men had been taking things from me since the day I buried my husband. So I signed. I paid what little I had toward it. And I moved my trunk and my linens and what remained of my pride into that leaning shed, with the dye works close enough that I could hear the creak of Corbin's barrels being rolled across the yard every morning before first light, a sound I would come to know better than I ever wished to, before that winter was through. He came to me on the third morning. I remember because I'd counted them, 3 mornings of that barrel creak sound before I saw the man attached to it. He was not what I expected from all the talk in town. Not some grasping, hard-eyed schemer, just a tired man, maybe 45, with dye stains up to his elbows that never seemed to wash clean, and a way of standing like his own shoulders were too heavy a load for him. He didn't waste words. Said he'd heard a widow had taken the low ground next to his works, and he wondered if I might do him a kindness. For pay, mind, not charity. Said the county had a disposal fee on spoiled dye waste that would near about ruin him if he had to pay it honest, on top of everything else that was already ruining him. Said he had 11 barrels sitting behind the works, wool gone wrong in the vats, over-mordanted, under-mordanted, dyes that had streaked and pooled and turned colors no customer would ever pay for, and he needed them gone before the county inspector came through in the spring. I asked him what gone meant to a man like that. He said he didn't rightly care so long as it wasn't sitting on his property when the inspector arrived. Said he'd pay me $2 to haul it onto my own ground and let it be my trouble instead of his. Now, child, I want you to understand, $2 was not nothing to me that winter. But I stood there a long moment before I answered, because some part of me knew even then that a man doesn't offer to pay a stranger to take his failures off his hands unless those failures are heavier than the coin he's parting with. I looked past him at the works, that low gray building with smoke curling thin from its chimney, barrels stacked crooked in the yard, and I thought of my own scrap of mud and how it couldn't get much worse for the having of 11 more barrels on it. So I said yes. Lord help me, I said yes before I'd even asked what color the ruin was, or whether it stank, or whether it was fit for anything at all beyond rotting into the ground come summer. I said yes because $2 was $2, and because some stubborn thing in me, the same thing that had signed for that muddy claim, wanted to prove I could turn even another man's trash into something that was mine to decide about. He shook my hand like I'd done him the greater favor, which I suppose, in his mind, I had. And that same afternoon I borrowed Otis Reyes's mule cart, and I hauled the first of those barrels across the frozen ruts myself, never once guessing what was waiting inside them, sealed up tight and stinking of vinegar and spoiled indigo. By the second week, my claim looked like something out of a fever dream. 11 barrels became 11 mountains once I'd pried the lids and let that ruined wool breathe. Great sodden heaps of it, some the color of a bruise, some the gray-green of pond scum, all of it reeking so strong that even the crows kept their distance. I stacked what I could under a lean-to I'd patched together from fence rails and an old wagon cover, and the rest I left out in the yard, because there simply wasn't room enough, nor strength enough in my 2 arms, to do otherwise. My granddaughter laughs now when I tell her how it smelled, vinegar and rot and something like burnt hair, but I promise you, child, there was nothing funny in it that January. The neighbors came to look, as neighbors will, not to help, just to look and to talk amongst themselves like I wasn't standing not 10 feet off with my sleeves rolled up. It was the storekeeper's wife who said it loudest, of course. She stood at the edge of my claim with her gloved hands folded over her middle, studying that stinking heap the way you'd study a grave that hadn't been dug deep enough, and she said, loud enough for the whole hollow to hear, that a woman with no husband to guide her had no business trusting a man like Elias Corbin, and that I'd been handed his garbage and called it a bargain. She said it to the Pruitt sisters, and to old Mr. Kessler, and to anyone else fool enough to walk down that road that morning, and every one of them nodded along like she'd read it straight from Scripture. $2 for the privilege of drowning in another man's failures, she said. I'd have paid twice that to keep it off my land. I didn't answer her that day. I only bent back to my washtub, because the water Otis had helped me haul was already going cold, and cold water does no favors for wool that's fighting you every step of the way. But I heard her. Lord, I heard every word, and some nights, lying in that cabin with the wind finding every crack in the boards, I heard it again in my own voice, wondering if she wasn't right after all. The pile grew faster than I could touch it. Barrel after barrel, die after ruined die, until my little scrap of mud looked less like a homestead and more like the leavings of some great wounded animal, and the whole hollow, it seemed, had decided I was the fool who'd taken its carcass in trade for $2 silver and a handshake. Grandmother, my own granddaughter, asked me once, tugging that same rug across her knees, didn't you want to just give up? Just admit you'd been cheated? And I told her what I'm telling you now. Some nights I did want to give up, but mornings are different from nights. Mornings, the light comes through thin and honest, and it was on one such morning, with frost still silvering the fence rails, that I hauled the first real batch of that wool to my well and began to wash it proper. I want you to understand what washing wool like that means. It isn't quick. You soak it, you skim the filth, you soak it again, and your hands go raw and cracked from the cold, no matter how careful you are with the lye. I'd done it 100 times before, wool that came clean and plain and gray-white as it was meant to, but this wool wasn't plain. As the grime lifted away, the soot, the mud, the crust of old dye gone wrong, something else came up from beneath it, something I hadn't expected at all. Color. Not the ruined, muddy brown everyone assumed was under all that filth. Real color. Deep indigo bleeding into rust, a streak of gold running crooked through gray, like a vein of ore through rock. Patches of green so dark they looked almost black, until the sun caught them just right. I stood there at that well, with my hands dripping and my breath fogging in front of me, and I laughed. I laughed out loud, alone, in that yard, because I understood all at once what had happened. Corbin's batches hadn't just failed. They'd failed in 100 different ways, each barrel its own small disaster, each disaster leaving behind a pattern no living soul could ever plan or repeat. One die had taken unevenly, another had been left too long, or not long enough. A fire under one vat must have run too hot, scorching color into the fiber in streaks nobody would ever call intentional, and yet there it was, marbled and strange and, I swear to you, beautiful. I carried that first clean hank inside and laid it across the table by the window, and I sat and looked at it the way you'd look at something you'd found buried in an old trunk, not sure yet what you'd stumbled onto, only sure it wasn't trash. I didn't tell Sarah Tillman. I didn't tell anyone. I went back out to that well the next morning, and the one after that, my knuckles splitting, my back aching, hauling water and wringing wool until my arms shook. Because somewhere in the middle of all that ruin, I'd found something no clean batch of dye, no careful mill, no proper craftsman could ever have made on purpose. And I understood, standing there in the cold, that I had a great deal more washing left to do. That winter came down hard, granddaughter, harder than any I'd known before or since. Snow packed against the door so thick, some mornings I had to push my whole shoulder into it just to get out to the well. But cold or not, there was carding to be done, and carding waits for no woman's comfort. I sat up by the hearth every evening once the chores were finished, a lantern pulled close, and I taught myself to card that wool the way my own mother had shown me years before, on wool nowhere near so troublesome. 2 paddles, bristled with wire teeth, drawing the fibers straight and smooth between them. Simple enough to describe, cruel enough to do, hour after hour, night after night, when your hands are already raw from washing and wringing. The blisters came first across my palms, then split, then healed hard as leather by the time the deep snows set in. I recall holding my hands up to that lantern light some nights, turning them over, hardly recognizing them as my own. These were not the hands of the young bride who'd once embroidered fine linens for her hope chest. These were a homesteader's hands now, and I was becoming someone I hadn't quite met before. I had no spinning wheel yet. That would come later, and I'll tell you how. So through the deepest part of that winter I spun by drop spindle, the old way, twisting the carded wool into yarn with nothing but patience and a weighted stick spinning at the end of a thread. It is slow, slow work, granddaughter. You draw the fiber, you let the spindle drop and turn, you wind the yarn, you draw again, over and over, for hours, until your shoulders ache and your eyes burn from the lantern smoke and your mind starts playing tricks, making you believe you've been at it for days rather than one single evening. But something happened in all that repetition. I stopped hating it. I stopped thinking of it as punishment for a bad bargain, the way Sarah Tillman surely believed it to be. Somewhere in the 100th hour, or maybe the 200th, I began to see the strange colors coming together in my hands. Rust bleeding into indigo, indigo fading into a green I couldn't name, all of it twisting into yarn that looked like nothing I'd ever seen sold in any shop window. I'd hold up a length of it toward the fire some nights, turning it, watching how the marbling shifted with the light, and I'd think, someone is going to want this. I didn't know who yet. I didn't know how. But a woman who has lost everything learns to trust small certainties when they come to her, and this was one of the surest I'd felt since my husband passed. By the time the first thaw cracked the ice on the well, I had baskets of that strange spun yarn stacked along the wall, and no proper way yet to weave a single thread of it into anything a body could use. "Grandmother," my granddaughter asked me once, holding that very first rug across her knees, "did you know how to weave back then? Truly know?" I laughed at that, the way I still laugh when I think of it. No, I did not know the first thing about weaving. I knew how to spin because my mother had taught me on a wheel, not unlike the one I'd borrowed, but a loom was a different animal altogether. All crossed beams and tension and math I didn't have words for. I had yarn enough to clothe half the hollow and no way to turn it into cloth. It was Otis Reyes who solved that particular trouble, though I never asked him to. He'd come by that spring with a wagon load of scrap lumber he meant to burn, offcuts from a barn raising, warped boards nobody wanted, a broken chair leg or two. He found me sitting on my step, staring at those baskets of yarn like they might weave themselves if I glared at them hard enough. He didn't say much. Otis never did. He just looked at the yarn, then at the wood in his wagon, then back at me, and something in his face shifted, like a man solving a puzzle he hadn't known he'd been carrying around. "You got a loom somewhere I don't know about?" he asked. I told him I hadn't the faintest notion where a woman in my position might get one. He came back 3 days later with that same wagon, only now it was loaded different. Beams cut to length, a frame half assembled, pegs whittled smooth. He wouldn't take a penny for it. Said the wood was headed for the fire pile anyway, and a fire pile doesn't need lumber that straight. We set it up together in my front room, and I remember how patient he was, showing me warp from weft, how to keep tension even, how a mistake 3 rows back would show itself eventually no matter how you tried to hide it. He wasn't a talker, Otis, but he came back near every evening that week to check my progress, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watching the shuttle pass through the shed like he was watching something being born. I think he saw in that lumber the same thing I'd started seeing in the yarn, something worth saving, worth building, if a person only had the patience to look twice at what everyone else had already thrown away. He never once mentioned Sarah Tillman's talk, or the neighbors who still crossed the road rather than pass my gate. He just kept coming back with more wood when I needed it, more nails, a straighter beam when one warped. By the second week of March, I sat down at that homemade loom with my first true skein of marbled yarn stretched across the warp, my hands shaking a little, and began the slow work of turning ruin into something a person could wrap around their shoulders on a cold night. My granddaughter, she picked up that first rug just now while I was talking, turned it over in her lap like she was trying to find the seam where the miracle started. There wasn't one. That's the thing nobody understood until they saw it with their own eyes. The colors didn't repeat. Not once across the whole width of it. Rust bleeding into a soft brown gray, then a streak of something almost blue, where the dye had gone wrong in a way no millman would ever choose on purpose, and then a patch of deep plum that caught the lamplight different depending on where you stood. I wove 12 rows before I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't ruined wool anymore. It was a record of every mistake that had gone into those barrels, all of it turned soft and warm and strange under my hands. I finished that first rug on a Tuesday, I remember, because the well had frozen solid the night before and I'd had to chip ice just to boil water for tea. I hung it over the porch rail to air it out, same as I'd have done with any wash, not thinking a thing of it. And that's when Sarah Tillman came up the road with her basket, headed for who knows where, probably to carry some fresh piece of talk to the next house down. She stopped so sudden her basket near tipped. I watched her from the window, watched her set that basket down in the mud without even noticing, and walk halfway up my path just to look at it closer. She didn't say a word to me, didn't knock, didn't call out. Just stood there with her hand almost touching the wool, like she wasn't sure it was real, like she expected the colors to be some trick of the weather or the light. I came out onto the porch and she straightened up quick, embarrassed to be caught staring at something she'd spent all winter calling trash. "Where'd you get dye like that?" she said, and it wasn't a question so much as an accusation. Like I'd been hiding something from the town, instead of hauling barrels of stinking waste up from that dye works with my own 2 hands in the freezing cold. I told her the truth. I told her it was Corbin's ruined batches, the same barrels she'd laughed about all winter, the same mountain of stained fibers she'd told half of Millrace Hollow I'd been swindled into taking. She didn't have much to say to that. She picked her basket back up out of the mud, gave the rug one more long look, and went on her way without another word. But I noticed she walked slower than before, like she was already turning something over in her mind, already wondering what else might be sitting behind my gate that she'd been too quick to call worthless. That was the thing about Sarah Tillman. She never kept a thought to herself for long, and by the next week, half the settlement had heard about the rug on my porch rail, though the story had already changed shape twice by the time it reached the far end of the valley. Some said I'd bought dye from a peddler passing through. Some said I'd found a trunk of old silk in the marsh. I let them talk. I had rugs to finish. Then came the real peddler, a thin, weathered man with a wagon full of tin pots and needles and thread, the kind who traveled the whole territory buying and selling as he went. He stopped at my gate one gray morning in March, more out of curiosity than anything, and I watched his face when I unrolled the second rug I'd made, the one with the deep plum bleeding into a soft, smoky gray. He didn't say much either, at first. He just ran his hand over it slow, the way you'd touch something you were afraid might not hold still. Then he asked me straight out what I'd take for it, and when I told him I wasn't selling that one, he asked if I had others. I did. 6 by then, stacked in the corner of the cabin where the dye smell had long since faded into something warmer, something like wool and wood smoke. He bought 2 on the spot, more than I expected, and before he climbed back onto his wagon, he told me something I turned over in my mind for days after. He said he'd been buying and selling goods across 3 counties for 11 years, and he'd never once seen colors like mine, not from any mill, not from any dye house in Portland or Salem or anywhere north of the Columbia. He said mills tried for years to get patterns like that and never could, because it wasn't something you could plan. It was something that had to go wrong first. That stayed with me longer than I let on. I stood at the gate a good while after his wagon rattled off down the muddy road, thinking about the county fair that was coming in May, the one folks talked about all winter like it was Christmas and harvest rolled into one. Farmers brought their best hogs. Women brought their preserves and their quilts. I'd never had anything worth carrying before, but I did now. I had a cabin full of rugs and blankets nobody else in the territory could match, born out of barrels that had sat rotting on my land while the whole town laughed. I didn't sleep much that night, turning it over. How I'd get them there, how I'd price them, whether anyone would even look twice at a widow's table among the church ladies' jams. I decided before sunup. I was going to that fair. My granddaughter. I hitched that borrowed mule before the birds even started, loaded the wagon bed with every rug and blanket I'd made through that long winter, wrapped them in old feed sacks so the dust wouldn't touch them. My hands shook the whole ride in, not from the cold, though there was plenty of that too, but from wondering if I'd made a fool of myself thinking any of it mattered outside my own 4 walls. The fairground was already crowded when I got there, wagons lined up 3 deep, the smell of frying dough and horse sweat and cut hay hanging over everything. I found a spot at the end of a row, past the quilting tables, past a man selling tin pans that clattered every time the wind picked up. I laid out my rugs right there on the grass, nothing fancy, no table even, just cloth spread wide so folks could see the color. And, oh, the color. In that morning light, it looked like something poured down from heaven, grays bleeding into blues, rust washing into gold. No 2 patches alike anywhere in the whole piece. I stood behind them, feeling small, waiting for someone to laugh the way they had back home. Nobody laughed. A woman stopped first, then her husband, then their 2 children, all 4 of them just staring down at that rug like it might move. She asked what dye I'd used. I told her the truth, that it wasn't dye I'd chosen at all, that it was ruin, wool nobody wanted, wool a whole town had mocked me for hauling. She didn't care. She wanted to know the price. By noon I'd sold 3 blankets and 2 rugs, and by the time the sun dropped low over the fairground, my wagon bed was near empty and my apron pocket was heavy with coin I hadn't dared to imagine that morning. Women came back a second time, bringing sisters, bringing neighbors from towns I'd never even heard the names of: Pine Hollow, Cedar Bend, someplace called Aldersgate, 2 counties east. Every one of them said the same thing, one way or another. They'd never seen a mill make anything like it, and they never would, because a mill would never let a batch go wrong on purpose. One old farmer pressed a folded bill into my hand and told me to make him another exactly like the one he'd bought, and I had to tell him, gently as I could, that I couldn't. There'd never be another exactly like it. That seemed to please him more than anything. I rode home in the dark that night, mule plodding slow, wagon light and empty behind me, and for the first time since my husband passed, I let myself cry. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to disbelief, wondering just how far this strange gift of ruin might carry me yet. My granddaughter. I still remember the morning I counted that money out on the kitchen table, coins and folded bills every color of worn leather, and found it came to more than the claim itself required. I sat there a long while just looking at it, afraid to touch it again, afraid it might prove itself a dream after all. Then I put on my good dress, the one with the collar I'd mended so many times it was more stitch than cloth, and I walked the 4 miles into town rather than hitch the mule, because I wanted the walking. I wanted the time to believe it. The county land office smelled of ink and wood smoke, same as it always had, and the clerk behind the counter was the same tired man who'd once looked at me like I was a fool for taking on that muddy strip of ground beside the dye works. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? I was just another widow in a mended dress, until I set that money down on his ledger and told him I'd come to settle my claim in full. He counted it twice. I remember that clear as anything. Twice. Like he thought his own eyes had lied to him the first time. Then he looked up at me, and something in his face changed, some small correction he was making inside himself, the way a man does when the world hands him a fact he hadn't planned for. He stamped the paper. I watched the ink settle into the page, black and final, and he slid it across to me and said, "Plain as you please. Congratulations, Mrs. Ashford. The land is yours. Not the bank's, not the county's. Mine, free and clear, bought with wool that men had thrown away as ruined trash." I walked out of that office and stood on the boardwalk a long moment, letter in hand, and I didn't cry that time. I just breathed. The street looked the same. Same dust, same mule teams, same crows picking at the grain spilled by the feed store, but I was not the same woman who'd walked in. I owned ground, my own ground. No landlord, no bank holding a note over my head, nothing between me and that muddy little claim but my own 2 hands and whatever I chose to build on it. I walked home slower than I'd come, turning that paper over now and then, just to feel its weight, and when I reached the cabin, I stood in the yard and looked at it. Really looked. The way you look at something for the first time, though I'd lived there through a whole hard winter already. It was mine now, truly mine, and standing there in the fading light, I had no notion yet that the dye works itself would soon come knocking, hat in hand, wanting back what they'd once thrown away. The old woman set the letter down then, that same paper I'd been holding in my mind's eye as she spoke, and outside we both heard it. Wheels on the lane, a horse blowing hard after the long pull-up from the hollow. She didn't startle. She just smiled, the way you smile at weather you've been expecting. "That'll be them," she said. I went to the window. A wagon sat in the yard, and a man climbed down from it, gray-headed now, moving careful the way old bones move, and behind him a younger fellow who I took for his son. I recognized the name painted faded on the wagon side before she even said it. Corbin and Sons Dye Works. "They still buy scraps," she said, rising slow from her chair, "on account of there's still nothing like what came off my land that first winter. Never has been since. Batches like that don't happen twice. Not on purpose, not by accident either. Not in 40 years of trying." She walked out onto the porch with me trailing behind, and I watched the son do the talking while the old man, Corbin himself, I understood then, the very one from her story, stood back with his hat in his hands like a boy called before a schoolteacher. They wanted her wool ends, the odd marbled leavings from her latest rugs, the kind no mill could match. They asked would she consider a price. She didn't hurry. She looked out over her land, the fences she'd built, the barn, the garden rows still holding their last summer green, and I understood in that moment, really understood, that she wasn't deciding anything. She'd decided long ago. She was only letting them wait long enough to feel it. Then she named her price, plain and even, the way you'd state the weather, and the son nodded and shook her hand, and the old man said, "Quiet. Fair enough, Widow Ashford." Fair enough, like the words cost him something and were worth every bit of it. When the wagon rolled off down the lane, she came back and sat beside me, and picked up that first rug again, the marbled one, worn soft as a Sunday quilt. "They laughed at me once," she said, "called it trash, called me foolish for hauling it home." She smoothed the rug over her knees. "Everything I built out of what somebody else was glad to be rid of." I sat with that a long while, the fire popping low, her hand resting light on that old rug, and I understood then what she'd been trying to tell me the whole evening. Not just how she'd survived, but how she'd looked at ruin and seen a beginning nobody else could see. And I thought, watching her, that I would remember this longer than anything else she ever